All right, so today we're really diving into some pretty dense stuff with Michel Foucault.
Yeah.
His 2 lectures from 1976. And, Foucault, always kind of a challenge, right?
Right.
And here he is in these lectures, really kind of wrestling with his own research. He even called it fragmented and repetitive, almost like he's catching glimpses of something really profound but can't quite fully grasp it.
It's true. It's like he's inviting us along for the ride,
Right.
with all of the frustrations and the dead ends and the breakthroughs. And he even compares his work to a whale, which I always loved that image.
Yeah.
Those brief moments, it breaches the surface, just suggesting this massive depth hidden beneath. And it really resonates with his whole approach to knowledge and power.
It really does, because it is about those hidden depths, right? He doesn't just come out and say, here's my big idea, here's my grand unified theory. He's talking about idle knowledge, even referencing secret societies at one point, and the great warm and tender Freemasonry of useless erudition. It's Foucault kind of pulling back the curtain on academic traditions and saying, what if we challenge these hierarchies of knowledge?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he's really interested in the knowledge that's often kind of dismissed or marginalized, right? The kind that simmers beneath the surface of, that kind of accepted discourse.
Right.
The stuff that we overlook or we dismiss as unimportant. It's in those forgotten corners, those useless pursuits, where he finds like the real insights into power and how it shapes our world.
Yeah. And that brings us to, I think, one of the ideas that, when you encounter it, you really have to stop and kind of wrap your head around it. This idea of dispersed and discontinuous offensives. I'll be honest. Sounds a little bit cryptic at first. What is he getting at here?
It's like he's taking the traditional view of power and just completely flipping it on its head. Like, forget this idea of a single dominating force, right? He's saying that power is so much more insidious, more like a network of capillaries than a major artery. And it operates through these offensives, points of resistance that pop up in these really unexpected places, and they challenge those norms, the assumptions that really underpin the whole established order.
So instead of one big revolution, it's these localized acts of defiance that kind of chip away at the foundations of power.
Precisely. I mean, think about the anti-psychiatry movement that Foucault was so interested in, or even feminist critiques of traditional family structures. These weren't just social movements. They were dispersed and discontinuous offensives, challenging those very categories we use to define sanity, family, and ultimately ourselves.
And this is where his idea of subjugated knowledges becomes so important, right? It's not just about recognizing those points of resistance, but really understanding the alternative ways of knowing, the perspectives that have been silenced or pushed aside.
Absolutely. He divides these subjugated knowledges into 2 really fascinating categories. First, you've got this erudite knowledge. And you can think here about like the meticulous research of a historian uncovering forgotten texts, or the linguist tracing like the evolution of language. It's knowledge buried within knowledge, often deemed too specialized or irrelevant by the mainstream.
Right. And then on the other hand, you have local popular knowledges. And this is like the lived experiences of everyday people.
Yes.
The traditions, the practices that kind of bubble up and challenge the dominant narrative, right?
Right.
It's the kind of knowledge that sometimes is dismissed as anecdotal, unscientific, but really holds such valuable insights into how power actually operates on the ground.
Yes, exactly. And so to kind of excavate these subjugated knowledges, Foucault gives us this tool, this method he calls genealogy.
Okay.
And it's like an archaeologist, meticulously brushing away layers of sediment, right? Genealogy helps us to trace those historical struggles, those power dynamics that have shaped what we accept as the truth today.
So instead of just kind of taking the dominant narrative at face value, genealogy encourages us to ask, who benefits from this version of history? Whose voices are missing? What are we not seeing? It's about uncovering the power dynamics that shape knowledge itself.
Exactly. And what I think makes Foucault's approach so compelling is that he doesn't shy away from those inherent paradoxes. He acknowledges that even as he's trying to liberate these subjugated knowledges, he's still engaging in this very scholarly tradition.
Right.
That has its own power dynamic.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah.
So it really raises the question, can we ever truly escape the structures that we're trying to dismantle?
It's a question that I think lingers as we go further, right?
Yeah.
Because now we're going to delve even deeper into Foucault's analysis of power.
Okay.
And it's where things, I think, get even more intriguing. Because now he's challenging us to rethink power, not as something you possess, but as this force that operates through us.
Yeah. And a force that's always shifting, always in flux. He draws on Nietzsche's idea of the hostile engagement of forces to illustrate this. And I think this is really key to understanding why Foucault is still so relevant today.
So we're really shifting away from this idea of like kings and governments holding all the power, right? And instead we're looking at power as this almost like invisible web that shapes how we live and think. It's a bit unsettling when you really start to think about it.
Oh, absolutely. It's unsettling because it's not just about, restricting our freedom. It's about like producing certain kinds of individuals. And this is where he introduces this idea of docile bodies.
Okay. Yeah, break that down for me. Docile bodies. It does sound a little ominous.
Yeah, it sounds very like dystopian sci-fi. But it's Foucault's way of describing how power works in these really subtle ways to create people who are self-regulating, who conform to these societal norms. And so think about all the different institutions we encounter, right? Schools, hospitals, the workplace, they all have these systems in place that encourage certain behaviors and discourage others.
Right. So it's not necessarily about like somebody standing over you with a rule book. It's about internalizing those rules and norms until they become like second nature to you.
Exactly. We learn to discipline ourselves to conform to expectations, often without even realizing it's happening. And this is where that connection between knowledge and power becomes even more insidious, because what we accept as normal is often determined by the very systems of power that we're talking about.
Right. So it's like a vicious cycle almost. Power shapes knowledge, which then reinforces the existing power structures, and on it goes.
Exactly. It's a self-perpetuating system. And that's why Foucault, I think, stresses the importance of questioning everything, of constantly being on the lookout for those subjugated knowledges that can offer us a different perspective, a way out of that cycle.
This all sounds a bit overwhelming, to be honest. If power is so deeply embedded in everything, is resistance even possible?
That is the million-dollar question, right? And Foucault doesn't necessarily offer this like simple solution. There's no magic bullet to dismantle these power structures. In fact, he even acknowledges the paradox that in his own work, in his very meticulous scholarship, he's still operating within the systems that he's critiquing.
So it's not necessarily about toppling the entire system, but about, I guess, becoming more aware of how it functions, those subtle ways that it influences our lives, and then maybe finding those small spaces where you can push back or challenge those assumptions.
Exactly. It's about asking those really critical questions, like who benefits from this particular way of seeing the world? Who benefits from this system of knowledge? Whose voices are being silenced? What alternative perspectives are we ignoring?
And Foucault himself uses his scholarship to do that, right? To kind of highlight those subjugated knowledges that have been kind of hidden throughout history. He's like a detective looking for clues in those overlooked corners.
Totally.
Yeah.
And he wants to equip us all to be those detectives, to be skeptical of the dominant narratives, to uncover those hidden power dynamics that shape our world.
It's interesting you use that word detective, because his method of genealogy really is about tracing lineages and digging into the past to understand the present.
Exactly. It's like tracing your family tree. You start with yourself, and then you look back at your parents, your grandparents, and so on. And as you go further and further back, you start to uncover these hidden stories, these family secrets, these power dynamics that might have shaped your own life in ways you never even realized.
And just like in a family, those hidden stories can be both empowering and kind of unsettling at the same time, right? We might discover this incredible resilience in our ancestors, but also some uncomfortable truths about, how power was wielded.
Yeah, that's the power of genealogy, right? It's not about glorifying the past. It's about understanding it, words and all. And in doing so, we can gain a much clearer picture of the present and maybe even start to imagine different futures.
It strikes me that even Foucault's writing style, which some people find very dense and challenging, kind of reflects this idea of unearthing hidden meanings. He doesn't really spoon-feed his readers. He kind of makes you work for those insights.
And I think that's totally intentional. He wants us to be active participants in this process of uncovering these truths. We have to wrestle with these ideas, not just passively consume them. It's about becoming more conscious, more critical thinkers.
So as we kind of delve deeper into these lectures, let's keep in mind this idea of knowledge as a tool for uncovering those often hidden power dynamics. And it's not always about finding easy answers, but about asking the right questions. And maybe those questions will lead us to a more just and equitable world. It's like Foucault is giving us this whole toolkit, these lenses through which we can examine the world. And one of the most powerful ones in that kit, I think, is this reframing of power itself. It's not about like who's got it and who doesn't. It's about the way that it operates in these kind of like often invisible ways.
Yeah, he really wants us to move beyond that like really simplistic view of power as a thing, right? Something that is hell or possessed. Because if we're only focused on the obvious, the people in authority, then we miss all these other ways that power is working in our everyday interactions, in the very language we use. It's like trying to understand the ocean by only looking at the waves on the surface.
Oh, I like that analogy. Because you're right, we miss so much if we're not willing to go deeper.
Exactly.
He wants us to explore the currents, right? The subtle forces that are actually shaping the whole ecosystem.
Exactly. And one of those really powerful currents is this idea that power at its core is repressive.
Okay.
It's not just about, controlling what we do, but also shaping how we think, how we see ourselves, how we see the world around us.
And that really connects back to that whole idea of docile bodies, right? It's not about overt, force or coercion. It's about how we internalize these norms and expectations until we're basically policing ourselves.
Exactly. And I think that's why his analysis is still so relevant even today. I mean, just think about the pressure to conform, the pressure to fit in to achieve these certain metrics of success, these forces. They might not be as in your face as a prison guard or a dictator, but they're still incredibly powerful in shaping the way that we live our lives.
It's like those invisible fences they use for dogs now.
Yeah.
You don't see a physical barrier, but it's there because you get zapped if you get too close.
Right, exactly. Those are the mechanisms of power that Foucault wants us to be aware of.
So how do we start to see those invisible fences then? Those subtle mechanisms of power that we might even be unconsciously reinforcing ourselves?
Well, that's where his method of genealogy, I think, becomes really crucial. He's not just interested in what happened in the past. He wants us to understand how those past events, those power struggles, continue to shape the present.
It's like one of those true crime podcasts when they go back and revisit a cold case. They're not just rehashing the facts. They're looking for the missing clues or the alternative explanations that might actually shed some new light on what's happening today.
Totally. Yeah, and just like those podcasts, the answers are rarely simple or even satisfying. Genealogy isn't about uncovering a single truth. It's more about understanding this complex web of forces, this complex web of power dynamics that shape how we understand the past, the present, and even the future.
And, he has this other idea, I think, that really kind of illustrates this point, this idea of Nietzsche's hostile engagement of forces. And it's there's this constant tug of war going on, right?
Right.
Where no one force ever completely wins. It's about understanding that push and pull, the shifting alliances that actually shape how power actually operates in the world.
Yeah, it's a much more dynamic and nuanced view of power than I think we're used to with that traditional top-down model.
Right.
And it helps us to explain why social change is so complex and so messy. It's not simply a matter of just swapping out one group in power for another. It's about transforming the very systems, the invisible fences that are shaping all of our lives.
So if there's one thing our listeners take away from this deep dive into Foucault, what would you hope that would be?
I think Foucault would be over the moon if, even just one person listening to this became a more critical thinker, more aware of those really subtle ways that power is working in their own life. Because he's not really giving us a prescriptive answer or solution. He's offering a way of thinking, a set of tools that can help us challenge the status quo and maybe imagine new possibilities.
It's like he's saying, here's a flashlight. Now go explore those dark corners and let me know what you find.
Exactly.
It's about questioning everything, those dominant narratives, the things we take for granted as true, even our own assumptions about how the world works.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's really how change happens. Not through these grand pronouncements or these revolutions, but those small, everyday acts of questioning, of challenging, of resisting those subtle but very pervasive influences of power.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Foucault's work, remember this knowledge is power, but it's up to each and every one of us to use that knowledge wisely, ethically, and courageously to create a more just and more equitable world for everyone.